Now, the Buckeye Extra podcast with Rob Aller, Bill Rabinowitz, and Joey Kaufman from the Columbus Dispatch.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to a preview edition of the Buckeye Extra Football Podcast. I'm Joey Kaufman, joined by Bill Rabinowitz. We are headed up to the Pacific Northwest this weekend for Ohio State's big game at Oregon. I think this is the game a lot of people have had circled on their calendars. Ryan Day said as much earlier this week. Bill, how are we feeling about the Buckeyes' chances this weekend?
Are there calendars anymore? Do people circle dates on calendars?
Well, we're recording this podcast in my kitchen.
There's a calendar.
Here in your place.
There is. I can see a calendar behind you. Okay.
There's a calendar right behind me.
Well, I want you to look. October 12th. Is it circled on your calendar?
It's not circled, but there's I've written down the date of the game as if to remind myself that I will be there.
Okay. We should point out that Rob Aller, normally a participant on this fine podcast, is en route to Eugene as we speak, so he couldn't join us. I think Ohio State's the better team. I think top to bottom, I think they're better. I mean, Oregon has certainly got some really good players. If you were going to have a draft of the two rosters, it would not nearly be as lopsided as every other draft that Ohio State's had with their opponents the first 5 weeks. I mean, maybe Iowa, maybe Michigan State might have a handful of players that would go in the top 22. I'm not even sure about that. Oregon would have, certainly more than a handful. They're a good team. But I do think that Ohio State's talent overall is better. I have a lot of faith in the coaching staff, which I'm not sure I would have said in previous years. I'm not talking about Ryan Day necessarily, but the coordinators. I mean, I think that they finally have coordinators, offensive and defensive, that are really good. I think Oregon's got some staff. It's had some staff movement. But the big factor that weighs against Ohio State is obviously playing at Autzen. It's the road trip in and of itself. We know that these teams that are making these cross-country trips are 1-8 in the Big Ten, and Autzen's a tough place to play. So that's the one thing that kind of gives me pause.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting X factor in this game, and the way Ohio State is approaching that is they're not changing their routine at all. Ryan Day's been sort of insistent upon that throughout the week, that they're not going to rearrange the travel schedule, and they really had an opportunity to do so. The fall break at Ohio State is today, and I'd say we're recording this on Thursday, but it was Thursday and Friday this week, so there were no classes Thursday. They could have easily taken that as an opportunity to fly out and acclimate to the West Coast. They opted not to do that, practicing at home Thursday, flying out on Friday. And he said they're largely going to stay on East Coast time. The game's at 4:30 local kickoff, 7:30 Eastern. So it's not dramatically different than, say, last year when they played at Notre Dame in a primetime game on NBC. I think that makes some sense. This is not a case where Rutgers is going to play at USC next weekend, and that'll be an 8 p.m. local, 11 p.m. Eastern kickoff. That's late, and your body clock might require an adjustment there. Or you see it when West Coast teams go east, where they end up playing a noon game. Last week, UCLA was at Penn State. That was a 9 a.m. body clock kickoff for the Bruins. It was noon Eastern. So maybe in those situations, it forces you to recalibrate, but I don't think it's going to be a huge factor ultimately Saturday. I think it's going to be a matchup game, as they like to say, who ends up better than the other.
Let's talk about, the matchup at the position where the most important position, quarterback. At the start of the year, you would have said that Oregon would have a decided advantage, that Dylan Gabriel I think he was the Heisman favorite entering the season. Ohio State had Will Howard, who was, a good quarterback at Kansas State, but nobody was really talking about him at that level. And honestly, they're probably still not. But Dylan Gabriel's had his struggles. He threw 2 interceptions in the red zone last week against Michigan State. I did a podcast. Hopefully people, our listeners, will listen to that one as well. John Canzado, who's used to be the columnist of the Oregonian, has a talk show now, really knows his stuff. And he was saying that he thinks that Dylan Gabriel's transition has been a little bumpy. And I would say that the transition for Will Howard has been very smooth. I mean, they seem very happy with him. He seems very happy to be at Ohio State. It's really gone about as well as anyone could have hoped. He's had a couple picks that he liked to have back, which is part of the deal as a quarterback. But by and large, he's been really effective. He's thrown the ball very accurately in short and medium throws. He's been able to run the ball on occasion. He probably will start running a little more. And he kind of seems like he's enjoying this, right? I mean, he's really having fun being in this moment. I mean, he played at Kansas State, which is a big program, but it's not an Ohio State program. And he's got a kind of a big personality, and he's really enjoying this.
I do think both of these quarterbacks are being graded on curves a little bit. I mean, as you said, Gabriel came into the season as one of the leading candidates for the Heisman Trophy. And I think he had been around college football for such a long time and had such an established track record that people were expecting him to be a little more turnkey and a little bit more reliable from the jump. It hasn't played out that way. I think Will Howard came to Ohio State also with a little bit more to prove than Gabriel. So I think maybe that's why they're being viewed that way. That's just my sense of it. But it is an interesting subplot storyline, if you will, because both of these guys left schools that were in the Big 12 last year and are using their extra year of eligibility to transfer to their respective schools. And both Oklahoma now in the SEC, Kansas State went with younger quarterbacks. I mean, both of those guys, I think there's probably we don't really know the true situation either of those schools, but they didn't come back. I mean, Kansas State and Oklahoma both went to younger quarterbacks, and I think certainly Gabriel and Will Howard have held their own.
Yeah. Both teams, it's not just about the quarterbacks. Obviously, Will Howard has said that it's about the skilled people around him with running backs, Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. The Buckeyes are loaded there. Jordan James is a really good running back for Oregon. I watched the Michigan State game, and I was really impressed with him. He runs hard. He's kind of low to the ground a little bit, just powerful. Ohio State's going to have to be in their gaps. I mean, they were last week. They did a really good job, but that's going to be another test. And obviously, Oregon can throw it better than Iowa. Although, in fairness, Cade McNamara, until he got till the end, got knocked out. He played pretty well. I mean, it's really good throws, but Dylan Gabriel's a different kind of beast. And here's the other thing: Oregon's wide receivers are, by some measures, the best in the country. Now, Ohio State would take issue with that. Who would you want more than a trio of Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, and Carnell Tate, who's going to be back for this game, Ryan Day said. So, and you have Brandon Innes also as a factor.
So we think. Ryan Day, Ryan Day was asked if he was on track to return.
Yeah, ask, is he going to play, right? That was the question. Is he on track? Well, anyway, I'm on track to play, right? I mean, it's a very slow track to nowhere, but it's
well, there's been so much there's been so much gamesmanship, semantics around injuries where they're available, but they're available on an emergency basis. Yeah. It just it's a little difficult at times to parse. So I don't want to overpromise anything, but still, I would think if anybody's close to 100%, this would be. I think the Oregon game itself is probably a little bit more of an emergency basis than anybody they've played up to this point.
Yeah, if somebody is kind of on the fence and they think, okay, is this an important enough a game to play on? The answer is yes. But I tell you, knock on wood for Ohio State, they've been pretty healthy this year. I mean, they've lost, they didn't have Donovan Jackson for a couple games. They didn't have Cody Simon for a couple games. They didn't have Tyleik Williams for a couple games. But, this is a brutal, violent sport. And usually you're talking about multiple injuries at key positions. And they've been pretty fortunate so far. So, again, knock on wood if you're a Buckeye fan, but they've had their team.
Which you mentioned the Oregon's wide receivers. I think that'll be an interesting matchup with Ohio State's secondary because they've really kind of gone to this point in the season without having faced the skill position talent like Ohio State. Is that the matchup you are most intrigued by, or where else do you sort of see this game potentially being settled? Yeah,
that's the one that is fascinating because both teams' secondaries are elite and both teams' wide receiver units are elite. But I am kind of an old school guy in that way. I always think it's going to be one in the trenches. And, we remember 3 years ago, and I'm writing a story about this, that, 3 years ago, Ohio State hosted Oregon, second game of the year, second game of C.J. Stroud's, stint as a starting quarterback. And they embarrassed Ohio State. They ran for 270 yards or something. I forget the exact number. And it seemed like they ran the same play over and over. And Ohio State said, what do we do here? And that was the game that caused Ryan Day to strip Kerry Combs of his defensive coordinator duties. He promoted Matt Barnes, kind of a shotgun wedding, to run the defense the rest of the year. Both of those guys left at the end of the year. That was a rough season when it comes to the defense. I mean, they were bad. By Ohio State standards, they were awful. That was the reason that Ryan Day hired Jim Knowles. So if you want to say, okay, this Ohio State defense is night and day different than 3 years ago, it's because of that game and the forces that set in motion.
Yeah, I remember writing about the 2021 game and the lead up to it and noting this really in stories and all that Oregon was not the team Ohio State fans remembered from the national championship game, that Mario Cristobal had built them a lot more in the trenches than their previous iteration under Mark Helfrich. They were a lot more physical. They were a lot more of a sort of your SEC outfit, and Mario Cristobal is a former Nick Saban assistant. And I think the thing for now Oregon fans to remember as these teams continue to evolve, Ohio State is not the defense that they remember having faced. They're much more now of your old-fashioned Big Ten team where they rely on their defense and they rely on the ground game. It's these teams have changed over the years, and I think Dan Lanning, the new Oregon coach who replaced Cristobal, has kind of kept some of the things intact. Oregon had one of the best offensive lines in the country. They have a good defensive line as well with Jordan Burks. That was somebody that Chip Kelly brought up a lot in his press conference on Tuesday. Somebody for them to look out for as well. So the offensive defensive line matchups are going to be, I think, certainly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is everything you'd want it to be for a number 2 versus number 3 game. I mean, I think that both teams, well, particularly Oregon, they've moved up in the polls mainly because other teams have lost. I mean, I don't know that they've done anything that's been all that impressive. They looked really good against Oregon State. I watched that game. They looked really good. And Michigan State is Michigan State. They look like they're decent, and then they self-destruct. That's just kind of what Michigan State is right now. And they struggled early in the year with Idaho, first game, and then Boise State went down to the wire. And Boise State's not a bad team, and they're a pretty good team actually. But I couldn't see Ohio State even in an opener really struggling with Idaho. I mean, I just couldn't see it. I mean, they did struggle a tiny bit with Akron before blowing the doors off, but I don't think that game was ever really a game. So I think Ohio State is better. And if they can handle the atmosphere, and this is a veteran team, it should be able to do that. And the time change, which is kind of an unknown, but Ryan Day is kind of a mind over matter thing. I mean, that's what he's thinking right now. Then Ohio State, I think, has every reason to think they can win.
I think you could make the argument that I would say this about these two teams, that Ohio State certainly has played closer to perfect in the first month. I mean, I think they've been near flawless. Oregon, you could not say that. But I think the type of opponent certainly can help shape things, and in the matchup game where it's close and all that, we'll see how things go. Because you look at a guy like Will Howard, he's had pretty easy living. I mean, he's looked good. I don't mean to not knocking anything, but not faced a lot of pressure. They run the ball typically well, so they've bid on schedule. They've made good, and some of that is Will Howard himself making good decisions in the run pass option stuff, handing off at the right times. But this will test Ohio State in the obvious ways, just in terms of they're going to have to keep a clean pocket and how he throws the ball downfield and how Ohio State handles the rush. I think will change things. But you evaluate how the teams have performed in the actual games. Ohio State's looked better. Will Howard has made fewer mistakes than Dylan Gabriel, and I think that's that we both ended up picking Ohio State in this one.
I will say that Dylan Gabriel is kind of a wild card, because I think Dylan Gabriel is a really talented quarterback. And if he gets on a roll, he has a very quick release. He is mobile. He hasn't run a whole lot, but he can do that. And, if he kind of unleashes that, that's another X factor in this game. So I think that, Dylan Gabriel, I mean, I think about the Oklahoma game when Baker Mayfield was the quarterback. And if you remember, Ohio State went to Norman the year before and really took it to him. That was the Noah Brown game when Noah Brown was, like a superstar. And then Oklahoma comes to Columbus and Baker Mayfield had a game for the ages. I mean, that was really his Heisman game. And then they planted the flag, of course, which kind of overshadowed everything. But that's the only thing, or one of the main things I would say that's a concern if you're Ohio State, is that Dylan Gabriel's capable of having that kind of game where he just kind of is on fire and makes makes throws that there's really not a whole lot of defense for. He hasn't done that really this year. And why that is, who knows? I mean, I'm not close enough to the situation to know. But I think there is that potential where he could just be lights out and Ohio State, finds itself in a really tough battle.
I mean, he does have, trying to figure out how to best describe the quality, but just a maturity, a savviness, a moxie, whatever you want to describe it. There was a Gabriel had a couple years ago when they played there, maybe it was last year, where they played Texas and late in the game and the pocket collapsed and he jumps in the air to bide time and throws a touchdown. So you sort of see the creativity that he can bring, and that's the, as you said, Bill, a little bit of a wild card. I do think it gets tough to sometimes evaluate teams in the early go into the season because you don't know just sometimes the mindset where if you're a 3-touchdown favorite, how do you approach it? I mean, we've seen Ohio State at times where it looks like they're just maybe playing with their food a little bit. So I can maybe that was the issue with Oregon against Idaho. When you do look at them and you look at Oregon's maybe just not being quite flawless in the early goings, one thing that sticks out to me is a little bit is their pass protection has not been quite as good as it was last year. They returned a lot on the offensive line, but they've already given up more sacks than they allowed. Last year, they've allowed 7 this year. They allowed 5 all of last year. Gabriel's been under pressure more than Bo Nix was, about 22% or so rather than 15%. So that may be something for Ohio State to try to exploit. It's, I think, a big deal that Tyleik Williams is healthy and was able to return against Iowa. I would expect him and Ty Hamilton are going to play a lot of the snaps. And they played a lot of the snaps last week as well. Ohio State didn't rotate as heavily. And that's what they did last year against Notre Dame, where a lot of those guys in the defensive line played a bulk of the snaps. So that's something to keep a watch and an eye on as well.
Ohio State's off next week. So, they can maybe allow these guys to do that and realize that, they've got really 2 weeks to recover. I think it's a good point, what you said about Oregon's offensive line not being as good, because Ohio State's defensive line is really good. And I mentioned Gabriel could be a guy who goes off. He also could be a guy that Ohio State just smothers and just either knocks him out of the game or just demoralizes him, just beats him up. He's not a big guy. Dylan Gabriel's not a big guy. I mean, he's mobile and he's got a good arm and a quick release, but he's not Will Howard. Will Howard's 6'5", 235. He's not that.
No, I think part of this game is going to be won by which team can protect their quarterback better, and you can say that for most games in college football. But I think if you can rattle these quarterbacks, that they've shown that they can make decisions. Will Howard had that pick against Kansas State, or Michigan State, where he ends up throwing off the back foot off his first read. Had to throw last week. So if you can't get pressure on them, they're going to make mistakes. And both of these teams have pass rushers who can do that. They both have offensive lines that have shown their warts at times, even though both are largely pretty good, but they're not always perfect. So that to me is where the game could be won as well. I also think too, if that's the situation I could see Ohio State winning, is if their defensive line gets pressure and exploits Oregon's offensive line. I do want to see how this secondary performs against a better receiving core. And we've seen this team on third down give up some plays this year, maybe not being quite as good getting off the field. They're giving up a higher completion percentage on third down than a year ago. And maybe you tighten things up against a better outfit. But that's something I think to watch as well, where if Oregon is able to take advantage of Ohio State, it's their at times their inability to get off the field on third down, because we saw that at Marshall, or they got rid of the ball quickly, and it made things a lot tougher on Ohio State.
Yeah, and I don't think that we can declare a victory when it comes to Ohio State's offensive line quite yet. I mean, they looked really good against Iowa, but as Ryan Day said, he kind of didn't take the bait when he was asked this week, how good do you feel about the offensive line or some question like that. He was like, yes, they played well, but let's see what they do this week. I mean, I think this is a better offensive line. I mean, Josh Simmons is noticeably better this year than last year. Seth McLaughlin really has solidified the line at center. So they are playing well, but in Iowa was a good test. So I don't want to dismiss that, because that was a real test. But if you want to be an elite line, you got to do it every week. And so this will be a test. I mean, the Jordan Burch, Josh Fryer matchup. Josh Fryer is not the quickest guy in the world. Do they need to give him a little bit of help? Is Josh Fryer up to handling Birch? I mean, that's a question. I mean, I'm not saying I have the answer, but that's one. If you to say, okay, where's a matchup on the line that concerns you? I'd say that's probably the one. If in fact Jordan Birch lines up against him.
Yeah, that's the matchup that would most concern me if you're an Ohio State fan is that one right there, because we saw a couple weeks ago when Mike Green, the Marshall defensive end, was lined up against Fryer and made a quick spin move to get around. You could say that for most offensive line, that when you go up against the quick, strong edge rushers, that's it certainly gives you some concern, and that's, I think, the issue for Ohio State is can you block Birch and can you handle him off the edge, because that's probably sure the offensive line looked great against Iowa, but Iowa's nothing known for being fundamentally strong in the trenches and stopping teams against the run. I don't know if they're always flashing the talent on the edges and going up against quarterbacks that way. So I think that's something for Ohio State. That's going to be the test this week, is can you handle the quick edge rushers? And that's always the challenge for most teams. Yeah,
I mean, but the bottom line is this is finally where the Ohio State season really starts. Now, we knew that the preseason, or I was call it preseason, that's what it felt like. The non-conference part of the schedule was really the preseason. Michigan State was a step up. Iowa was, especially on defense, another step up. But this was the first time that you really thought Ohio State could lose a game. And if they win this game, they're probably in the playoff. I mean, I think that's what this game really is. Past years, I think we talked about this. Past years, you lose a game like this, you lose your margin for ever getting a playoff. That's not the case this year. But if you win this game, given what Ohio State's schedule is, Penn State's a test. Other than that, obviously Michigan, Indiana's obviously played well. Nebraska's better, but I don't think they're on anywhere near Ohio State's level. So you win this game, you really set yourself up for getting in the Big Ten championship game and for getting in the playoff. And again, if Ohio State doesn't make the playoff, it'd be shocking. I mean, that would be a huge disappointment. And there's no reason to think they won't make the playoff. But this would essentially qualify them for the playoff.
I think the other thing I'm wondering about this matchup too is the way Michigan's season has gone, and they've totally cratered. We came into this year thinking that you sort of had three marquee games: Oregon, Penn State, Michigan. I think it's basically two now. If you're looking at sort of the ultimate resume point, Oregon and Penn State are the two games, because I don't think Michigan's quite going to be that. Indiana is unbeaten, but I don't know how much the selection committee sort of shines your resume for beating Indiana. So it's a big opportunity for them to move up and solidify a spot in the Big Ten standings and get a win that'll certainly be at the top of the resume. And then the other side of the coin too is if they lose, I think people start getting the anxiety level among Ohio State fans, I think, will certainly increase, because
oh my God, yes.
Because the whole talk about Ryan Day and big games, and I think it's a little bit overwrought, because it's certainly, I think, relevant for the rivalry. But in terms of big games, they swept the Notre Dame home series. He's beaten Penn State every year. He's won twice in Happy Valley, one of them without fans, I guess. But 22 was a big crowd there. So I don't think it's quite entirely true, but that will certainly be a sticking point after the game for Day. It's interesting. Both of the coaches kind of have that carry that reputation a little bit, because Lanning's winless against Washington as well. They're one of their chief rivals.
Well, I think that probably sums it up pretty well. You got a fight to catch, and I got a fight to catch tomorrow morning. We will probably talk to you guys from Oregon if we can. It might be logistically a little tricky, but please follow our coverage at dispatch.com. We have you covered. And thank you for listening to the BuckeyeXtra Football Podcast. Joey, anything you want to add?
I think you said it all, Bill. Thanks for joining us.
I did.
Enjoy the game, everybody.
Be sure and subscribe to the BuckeyeXtra Podcast in the iTunes Store, the Google Play Store, or on Stitcher.